The line graph compares levels of unemployment among 16 to 24-year-olds with overall unemployment figures over a period of 20 years in England. It is clear that the proportion of young adults who were unemployed at any time between 1993 and 2012 was significantly higher than the overall proportion of adults without work. Unemployment rates for both groups of adults were consistently higher in London than in the rest of England. In 1993, around 18% of English 16 to 24-year-olds living outside London were unemployed. But the figure for those living in the capital was 5% higher, at 22%. Similarly, the overall adult unemployment rate in London, at 14%, was 4% higher than the rate in the rest of England. While levels of joblessness fell significantly over the following 10 years, the trend for higher levels in London and among young adults continued. Young adult unemployment in England rose dramatically between 2002 and 2012, from 12% to 21% outside London, and from around 15% to a peak of 25% in the capital. By contrast, the proportions of all adults without work remained below 10%, both in London and in the rest of the country. 193 words. Band 9. The line graph shows changes in the per capita consumption of beef, pork, broilers and turkey in the United States between 1955 and 2012. It is noticeable that beef was by far the most popular of the four types of meat for the majority of the 57-year period. However, a considerable rise can be seen in the consumption of broilers, with figures eventually surpassing those for beef. Between 1955 and 1976, U.S. beef consumption rose from around 60 to a peak of 90 pounds per person per year. During the same period, consumption of broilers also rose to nearly 30 pounds per person, while the figures for pork fluctuated between 50 and 40 pounds per person. Turkey was by far the least popular meat, with figures below 10 pounds per capita each year. By 2012, the amount of beef consumed by the average American had plummeted to around 50 pounds, but the consumption of broilers had doubled since the 1970s, to approximately 55 pounds per capita. By contrast, there were no significant changes in the trends for pork and turkey consumption over the period as a whole. The line graph compares figures for daily travel by workers in the UK using 3 different forms of transport over a period of 60 years. It is clear that the car is by far the most popular means of transport for UK commuters throughout the period shown. Also, while the numbers of people who use the car and train increase gradually, the number of bus users falls steadily. In 1970, around 5 million UK commuters traveled by car on a daily basis, while the bus and train were used by about 4 million and 2 million people respectively. In the year 2000, the number of those driving to work rose to 7 million and the number of commuting rail passengers reached 3 million. However, there was a small drop of approximately 0.5 million in the number of bus users. By 2030, the number of people who commute by car is expected to reach almost 9 million. And the number of train users is also predicted to rise to nearly 5 million. By contrast, buses are predicted to become a less popular choice, with only 3 million daily users. The line graph compares average yearly spending by Americans on mobile and landline phone services from 2001 to 2010. It is clear that spending on landline phones fell steadily over the 10-year period, while mobile phone expenditure rose quickly. The year 2006 marks the point at which expenditure on mobile services overtook that for residential phone services. In 2001, U.S. consumers spent an average of nearly $700 on residential phone services, compared to only around $200 on cell phone services. Over the following 5 years, average yearly spending on landlines dropped by nearly $200. By contrast, expenditure on mobiles rose by approximately $300. In the year 2006, the average American paid out the same amount of money on both types of phone service, spending just over $500 on each. By 2010, expenditure on mobile phones had reached around $750, while the figure for spending on residential services had fallen to just over half this amount. The line graph compares the percentage of people aged 65 or more in 3 countries over a period of 100 years. It is clear that the proportion of elderly people increases in each country between 1940 and 2040. Japan is expected to see the most dramatic changes in its elderly population. In 1940, around 9% of Americans were aged 65 or over, compared to about 7% of Swedish people and 5% of Japanese people. The proportions of elderly people in the USA and Sweden rose gradually over the next 50 years, reaching just under 15% in 1990. By contrast, the figures for Japan remained below 5% until the early 2000s. Looking into the future, a sudden increase in the percentage of elderly people is predicted for Japan, with a jump of over 15% in just 10 years from 2030 to 2040. By 2040, it is thought that around 27% of the Japanese population will be 65 years old or more, while the figures for Sweden and the USA will be slightly lower, at about 25% and 23% respectively. The graph shows changes in the number of cars per household in Great Britain over a period of 36 years. Overall, car ownership in Britain increased between 1971 and 2007. In particular, the percentage of households with 2 cars rose, while the figure for households without a car fell. In 1971, almost half of all British households did not have regular use of a car. Around 44% of households had 1 car, but only about 7% had 2 cars. It was uncommon for families to own 3 or more cars, with around 2% of households falling into this category. The 1-car household was the most common type from the late 1970s onwards, although there was little change in the figures for this category. The biggest change was seen in the proportion of households without a car, which fell steadily over the 36-year period to around 25% in 2007. In contrast, the proportion of 2-car families rose steadily, reaching about 26% in 2007, and the proportion of households with more than 2 cars rose by around 5%. The line graph compares 4 sectors in terms of the amount of acid rain emissions that they produced over a period of 17 years in the UK. It is clear that the total amount of acid rain emissions in the UK fell considerably between 1990 and 2007. The most dramatic decrease was seen in the electricity, gas and water supply sector. In 1990, around 3.3 million tons of acid rain emissions came from the electricity, gas and water sector. The transport and communication sector was responsible for about 0.7 million tons of emissions, while the domestic sector produced around 0.6 million tons. Just over 2 million tons of acid rain gases came from other industries. Emissions from electricity, gas and water supply fell dramatically to only 0.5 million tons in 2007, a drop of almost 3 million tons. While acid rain gases from the domestic sector and other industries fell gradually, the transport sector saw a small increase in emissions, reaching a peak of 1 million ton in 2005. 169 words, Band 9. The line graph compares the percentage of people in 3 countries who used the Internet between 1999 and 2009. It is clear that the proportion of the population who used the Internet increased in each country over the period shown. Overall, a much larger percentage of Canadians and Americans had access to the Internet in comparison with Mexicans, and Canada experienced the fastest growth in Internet usage. In 1999, the proportion of people using the Internet in the USA was about 20%. The figures for Canada and Mexico were lower, at about 10% and 5% respectively. In 2005, Internet usage in both the USA and Canada rose to around 70% of the population, while the figure for Mexico reached just over 25%. By 2009, the percentage of Internet users was highest in Canada. Almost 100% of Canadians used the Internet, compared to about 8% of Americans and only 40% of Mexicans. The bar chart compares the amount of time spent by people in the UK on 3 different types of phone call between 1995 and 2002. It is clear that calls made via local fixed lines were the most popular type, in terms of overall usage, throughout the period shown. The lowest figures on the chart are for mobile calls. But this category also saw the most dramatic increase in user minutes. In 1995, people in the UK used fixed lines for a total of just over 70 billion minutes for local calls, and about half of that amount of time for national or international calls. By contrast, mobile phones were only used for around 4 billion minutes. Over the following 4 years, the figures for all 3 types of phone call increased steadily. By 1999, the amount of time spent on local calls using landlines had reached a peak at 90 billion minutes. Subsequently, the figure for this category fell, but the rise in the other 2 types of phone call continued. In 2002, the number of minutes of national, international landline calls passed 60 billion. While the figure for mobiles rose to around 45 billion minutes, 197 words, band 9. The 2 charts compare the populations of France and India in terms of age distribution by gender in the year 1984. It is clear that the population of India was younger than that of France in 1984, with a noticeably larger proportion of people aged under 20. France, on the other hand, had a significantly larger percentage of elderly inhabitants. In India, close to 14% of people were aged 5 or under, and each 5-year age bracket above this contained an increasingly smaller proportion of the population. France's population, by contrast, was more evenly distributed across the age ranges, with similar figures, around 7% to 8% of all people, for each 5-year cohort between the ages of 0 and 40. Somewhere between 10% and 15% of all French people were aged 70 or older. But the equivalent figure for India was only 2%. Looking more closely at gender, there was a noticeably higher proportion of French women than men in every cohort from age 50 upwards. For example, almost 3% of French 70 to 75-year-olds were women, while just under 2% were men. No significant gender differences can be seen on the Indian population chart. The bar chart compares the turnover in dollars from sales of video games for 4 different platforms, namely mobile phones, online, consoles and handheld devices from 2000 to 2006. It is clear that sales of games for 3 out of the 4 platforms rose each year, leading to a significant rise in total global turnover over the 7-year period. Sales figures for handheld games were at least twice as high as those for any other platform in almost every year. In 2000, worldwide sales of handheld games stood at around $11 billion, while console games earned just under $6 billion. No figures are given for mobile or online games in that year. Over the next 3 years, sales of handheld video games rose by about $4 billion. But the figure for consoles decreased by $2 billion. Mobile phone and online games started to become popular, with sales reaching around $3 billion in 2003. In 2006, sales of handheld, online and mobile games reached peaks of $17, $9 and $7 billion respectively. By contrast, turnover from console games dropped to its lowest point, at around $2.5 billion. The bar chart shows the number of hot dogs and buns eaten in 15 minutes by the winners of Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest in Brooklyn, USA between 1980 and 2010. It is noticeable that the number of hot dogs and buns eaten by winners of the contest increased dramatically over the period shown. The majority of winners were American or Japanese, and only one woman had ever won the contest. Americans dominated the contest from 1980 to 1996, and the winning number of hot dogs and buns consumed rose from only 8 to around 21 during that time. 1983 and 1984 were notable exceptions to the trend for American winners. In 1983, a Mexican won the contest after eating 19.5 hot dogs, almost double the amount that any previous winner had eaten. And 1984 saw the only female winner, Birgit Felden from Germany. A Japanese contestant, Takeru Kobayashi, reigned as hot dog eating champion for 6 years from 2001 to 2006. Kobayashi's winning totals of around 50 hot dogs were roughly double the amount that any previous winner had managed. However, the current champion, American Joey Chestnut, took hot dog eating to new heights in 2009 when he consumed an incredible 68 hot dogs and buns in the allotted 15 minutes. The bar chart compares 12 countries in terms of the overall number of medals that they have won at the Olympic Games. It is clear that the USA is by far the most successful Olympic medal-winning nation. It is also noticeable that the figures for gold, silver and bronze medals won by any particular country tend to be fairly similar. The USA has won a total of around 2,300 Olympic medals, including approximately 900 gold medals, 750 silver and 650 bronze. In second place on the all-time medals chart is the Soviet Union, with just over 1,000 medals. Again, the number of gold medals won by this country is slightly higher than the number of silver or bronze medals. Only 4 other countries, the UK, France, Germany and Italy, have won more than 500 Olympic medals, all with similar proportions of each medal color. Apart from the USA and the Soviet Union, China is the only other country with a noticeably higher proportion of gold medals, about 200, compared to silver and bronze, about 100 each, 178 words. Band 9. The bar charts compare students of different ages in terms of why they are studying and whether they are supported by an employer. It is clear that the proportion of students who study for career purposes is far higher among the younger age groups, while the oldest students are more likely to study for interest. Employer support is more commonly given to younger students. Around 80% of students aged under 26 study to further their careers, whereas only 10% study purely out of interest. The gap between these two proportions narrows as students get older, and the figures for those in their 40s are the same, at about 40%. Students aged over 49 overwhelmingly study for interest, 70%, rather than for professional reasons, less than 20%. Just over 60% of students aged under 26 are supported by their employers. By contrast, the 30 to 39 age group is the most self-sufficient, with only 30% being given time off and help with fees. The figures rise slightly for students in their 40s and for those aged 50 or more, 178 words. Band 9. The bar chart compares the number of incidents and injuries for every 100 million passenger miles traveled on 5 different types of public transport in 2002. It is clear that the most incidents and injuries took place on demand response vehicles. By contrast, commuter rail services recorded by far the lowest figures. A total of 225 incidents and 173 injuries per 100 million passenger miles traveled took place on demand response transport services. These figures were nearly 3 times as high as those for the second highest category, bus services. There were 76 incidents and 66 people were injured on buses. rail services experienced fewer problems. The number of incidents on light rail trains equaled the figure recorded for buses, but there were significantly fewer injuries, at only 39. Heavy rail services saw lower numbers of such events than light rail services, but commuter rail passengers were even less likely to experience problems. In fact, only 20 incidents and 17 injuries occurred on commuter trains. The first bar chart shows changes in the number of marriages and divorces in the USA, and the second chart shows figures for the marital status of American adults in 1970 and 2000. It is clear that there was a fall in the number of marriages in the USA between 1970 and 2000. The majority of adult Americans were married in both years, but the proportion of single adults was higher in 2000. In 1970, there were 2.5 million marriages in the USA and 1 million divorces. The marriage rate remained stable in 1980, but fell to 2 million by the year 2000. In contrast, the divorce rate peaked in 1980, at nearly 1.5 million divorces before falling back to 1 million at the end of the period. Around 70% of American adults were married in 1970, but this figure dropped to just under 60% by 2000. At the same time, the proportion of unmarried people and divorcees rose by about 10% in total. The proportion of widowed Americans was slightly lower in 2000. 174 words. Band 9. The bar chart compares the cost of an average house in 5 major cities over a period of 13 years from 1989. We can see that house prices fell overall between 1990 and 1995, but most of the cities saw rising prices between 1996 and 2002. London experienced by far the greatest changes in house prices over the 13-year period. Over the 5 years after 1989, the cost of average homes in Tokyo and London dropped by around 7%, while New York house prices went down by 5%. By contrast, prices rose by approximately 2% in both Madrid and Frankfurt. Between 1996 and 2002, London house prices jumped to around 12% above the 1989 average. Home buyers in New York also had to pay significantly more, with prices rising to 5% above the 1989 average. But homes in Tokyo remained cheaper than they were in 1989. The cost of an average home in Madrid rose by a further 2%, while prices in Frankfurt remained stable. 164 words. Band 9. The bar chart compares consumer spending on 6 different items in Germany, Italy, France and Britain. It is clear that British people spent significantly more money than people in the other 3 countries on all 6 goods. Of the 6 items, consumers spent the most money on photographic film. People in Britain spent just over £170,000 on photographic film, which is the highest figure shown on the chart. By contrast, Germans were the lowest overall spenders, with roughly the same figures, just under £150,000 for each of the 6 products. The figures for spending on toys were the same in both France and Italy, at nearly £160,000. However, while French people spent more than Italians on photographic film and CDs, Italians paid out more for personal stereos, tennis rackets and perfumes. The amount spent by French people on tennis rackets, around £145,000, is the lowest figure shown on the chart. The 3 bars charts show average years of schooling, numbers of scientists and technicians, and research and development spending in developing and developed countries. Figures are given for 1980 and 1990. It is clear from the charts that the figures for developed countries are much higher than those for developing nations. Also, the charts show an overall increase in participation in education and science from 1980 to 1990. People in developing nations attended school for an average of around 3 years. with only a slight increase in years of schooling from 1980 to 1990. On the other hand, the figure for industrialized countries rose from nearly 9 years of schooling in 1980 to nearly 11 years in 1990. From 1980 to 1990, the number of scientists and technicians in industrialized countries almost doubled to about 70 per 1,000 people. Spending on research and development also saw rapid growth in these countries, reaching $350 billion in 1990. By contrast, the number of science workers in developing countries remained below 20 per 1,000 people, and research spending fell from about $50 billion to only $25 billion, 187 words. The pie charts compare the expenditure of a school in the UK in 3 different years over a 20-year period. It is clear that teachers' salaries made up the largest proportion of the school's spending in all 3 years, 1981, 1991 and 2001. By contrast, insurance was the smallest cost in each year. In 1981, 40% of the school's budget went on teachers' salaries. This figure rose to 50% in 1991, but fell again by 5% in 2001. The proportion of spending on other workers' wages fell steadily over the 20-year period, from 28% of the budget in 1981 to only 15% in 2001. Expenditure on insurance stood at only 2% of the total in 1981, but reached 8% in 2001. Finally, the percentages for resources and furniture, equipment fluctuated. The figure for resources was highest in 1991, at 20%, and the proportion of spending on furniture and equipment reached its peak in 2001, at 23%. The pie charts compare the proportions of people falling into 3 distinct age groups in Yemen and Italy in 2 different years. It is clear that Italy had the older population in the year 2000. In that the same is predicted for the year 2050. The populations of both countries are expected to age over the 50-year period. In the year 2000, just over half of the population of Yemen was aged 14 or under, while most Italians, 61.6%, fell into the 15 to 59 age group, and only 14.3% were children under 15 years of age. People aged 60 or over accounted for almost a quarter of the Italian population, but only 3.6% of the inhabitants of Yemen. By 2050, the proportion of children under 15 is predicted to drop in both countries, most noticeably in Yemen, where the figure is expected to fall by 13.1%. On the other hand, the figures for elderly people are expected to rise by 2.1% in Yemen and a massive 18.2% in Italy. Finally, it is anticipated that the 15 to 59 age group will grow by around 10% in Yemen, but shrink by around 15% in Italy. 195 words. Band 9. The pie charts compare the proportion of carbohydrates, protein and fat in 3 different diets, namely an average diet, a healthy diet, and a healthy diet for sport. It is noticeable that sports people require a diet comprising a significantly higher proportion of carbohydrates than an average diet or a healthy diet. The average diet contains the lowest percentage of carbohydrates but the highest proportion of protein. Carbohydrates make up 60% of the healthy diet for sport. This is 10% higher than the proportion of carbohydrates in a normal healthy diet, and 20% more than the proportion in an average diet. On the other hand, people who eat an average diet consume a greater relative amount of protein, 40%, than those who eat a healthy diet, 30%, and sports people, 25%. The third compound shown in the charts is fat. Fat constitutes exactly 1/5 of both the average diet and the healthy diet, but the figure drops to only 15% for the healthy sports diet. The tables show the amount of money spent on fair trade coffee and bananas in 2 separate years in the UK, Switzerland, Denmark, Belgium and Sweden. It is clear that sales of fair trade coffee rose in all 5 European countries from 1999 to 2004, but sales of fair trade bananas only went up in 3 out of the 5 countries. Overall, the UK saw by far the highest levels of spending on the two products. In 1999, Switzerland had the highest sales of fair trade coffee, at €3 million. While revenue from fair trade bananas was highest in the UK, at €15 million. By 2004, however, sales of fair trade coffee in the UK had risen to €20 million. And this was over 3 times higher than Switzerland's sales figure for fair trade coffee in that year. The year 2004 also saw dramatic increases in the money spent on fair trade bananas in the UK and Switzerland, with revenues rising by €32 million and €4.5 million respectively. Sales of the two fair trade products were far lower in Denmark, Belgium and Sweden. Small increases in sales of fair trade coffee can be seen, but revenue remained at €2 million or below in all 3 countries in both years. Finally, it is noticeable that the money spent on fair trade bananas actually fell in Belgium and Sweden. 216 words. Band 9. The chart compares the amounts of waste that were produced in 6 countries in the years 1980, 1990 and 2000. In each of these years, the US produced more waste than Ireland, Japan, Korea, Poland and Portugal combined. It is also noticeable that Korea was the only country that managed to reduce its waste output by the year 2000. Between 1980 and 2000, waste production in the U.S. rose from 131 to 192 million tons, and rising trends were also seen in Japan, Poland and Portugal. Japan's waste output increased from 28 to 53 million tons, while Poland and Portugal saw waste totals increase from 4 to 6.6 and from 2 to 5 million tons respectively. The trends for Ireland and Korea were noticeably different from those described above. In Ireland, waste production increased more than 8-fold, from only 0.6 million tons in 1980 to 5 million tons in 2000. Korea, by contrast. The table compares the numbers of people who cycled to work in 12 areas of the UK in the years 2001 and 2011. Overall, the number of UK commuters who travelled to work by bicycle rose considerably over the 10-year period. Inner London had by far the highest number of cycling commuters in both years. In 2001, well over 43,000 residents of Inner London commuted by bicycle, and this figure rose to more than 106,000 in 2011, an increase of 144%. By contrast, although Outer London had the second highest number of cycling commuters in each year, the percentage change, at only 45%, was the lowest of the 12 areas shown in the table. Brighton and Hove saw the second biggest increase, 109%, in the number of residents cycling to work, but Bristol was the UK's second city in terms of total numbers of cycling commuters, with 8,108 in 2001 and 15,768 in 2011. Figures for the other 8 areas were below the 10,000 mark in both years. 172 words. Band 9. The table compares the percentages of people using different functions of their mobile phones between 2006 and 2010. Throughout the period shown, the main reason why people used their mobile phones was to make calls. However, there was a marked increase in the popularity of other mobile phone features, particularly the Internet search feature. In 2006, 100% of mobile phone owners used their phones to make calls, while the next most popular functions were text messaging, 73%, and taking photos, 66%. By contrast, less than 20% of owners played games or music on their phones, and there were no figures for users doing internet searches or recording video. Over the following 4 years, there was relatively little change in the figures for the top 3 mobile phone features. However, The percentage of people using their phones to access the internet jumped to 41% in 2008 and then to 73% in 2010. There was also a significant rise in the use of mobiles to play games and to record video, with figures reaching 41% and 35% respectively in 2010. The table shows percentages of consumer expenditure for 3 categories of products and services in 5 countries in 2002. It is clear that the largest proportion of consumer spending in each country went on food, drinks and tobacco. On the other hand, the leisure, education category has the lowest percentages in the table. Out of the 5 countries, consumer spending on food, drinks and tobacco was noticeably higher in Turkey, at 32.14%, and Ireland, at nearly 29%. The proportion of spending on leisure and education was also highest in Turkey, at 4.35%, while expenditure on clothing and footwear was significantly higher in Italy, at 9%, than in any of the other countries. It can be seen that Sweden had the lowest percentages of national consumer expenditure for food, drinks, tobacco and for clothing, footwear, at nearly 16% and just over 5% respectively. Spain had slightly higher figures for these categories, but the lowest figure for leisure, education, at only 1.98%, 155 words. Band 9. The table compares the average amount of time per day that men and women in the UK spend doing different activities. It is clear that people in the UK spend more time sleeping than doing any other daily activity. Also, there are significant differences between the time spent by men and women on employment, study and housework. On average, men and women in the UK sleep for about 8 hours per day. Leisure takes up the second largest proportion of their time. Men spend 5 hours and 25 minutes doing various leisure activities, such as watching TV or doing sport, while women have 4 hours and 53 minutes of leisure time. It is noticeable that men work or study for an average of 79 minutes more than women every day. By contrast, women spend 79 minutes more than men doing housework, and they spend over twice as much time looking after children. The table gives information about poverty rates among 6 types of household in Australia in the year 1999. It is noticeable that the levels of poverty were higher for single people than for couples, and people with children were more likely to be poor than those without. Poverty rates were considerably lower among elderly people. Overall, 11% of Australians, or 1,837,000 people, were living in poverty in 1999. Aged people were the least likely to be poor, with poverty levels of 6% and 4% for single-aged people and aged couples respectively. Just over 1/5 of single parents were living in poverty, whereas only 12% of parents living with a partner were classed as poor. The same pattern can be seen for people with no children. While 19% of single people in this group were living below the poverty line, the figure for couples was much lower, at only 7%, 150 words. Band 9. The table shows data about the underground rail networks in 6 major cities. The table compares the 6 networks in terms of their age, size and the number of people who use them each year. It is clear that the 3 oldest underground systems are larger and serve significantly more passengers than the newer systems. The London Underground is the oldest system, having opened in 1863. It is also the largest system, with 394 kilometers of route. The second largest system, in Paris, is only about half the size of the London Underground, with 199 kilometers of route. However, it serves more people per year. While only third in terms of size, the Tokyo system is easily the most used, with 1,927 million passengers per year. Of the 3 newer networks, The Washington, D.C. Underground is the most extensive, with 126 kilometers of route, compared to only 11 kilometers and 28 kilometers for the Kyoto and Los Angeles systems. The Los Angeles network is the newest, having opened in 2001, while the Kyoto network is the smallest and serves only 45 million passengers per year, 185 words.